Good afternoon. My name is Sandra Desautels, and I'm going to be speaking to you about Carousel VAT fraud today. Our session is divided pretty much into two segments, and I'm going to be giving you an overview of Carousel fraud, the impact of it, how it works generally. I think we had a really good session at the plenary today. You'll see there's a lot of similarities with what was presented by the two journalists. I regret I do not have any covert interviews or videos to entertain you today, but hopefully the case study that I'm going to talk to you about, which coincidentally also involves Denmark, will be of interest. And then I have with me as well today Imam Hoque, and am I saying that correctly, hopefully? And he's with Quantexa, and we are both consultancies. I know that was a hot topic this morning, but we're on the investigation side. So I'll kick it off a little by telling you a little about myself and why I'm talking about carousel fraud. So I am a director with Navigant, a guidehouse company, and I had over 10 years in law enforcement, federal law enforcement in Canada. I specialized in investigations, white-collar crime, and before I left the government, I was leading the public safety and security portfolio, looking into anti-terrorism and anti-terrorism financing. Since being in the private sector, I've specialized in investigations, both on the bribery and corruption side, as well as in the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing space. In terms of what I generally do, I do a lot of work with banks, as you can imagine. I train up their investigators. In the past several years, there's been a shift in terms of realizing that a KYC analyst may not necessarily be qualified to do your special investigations. So I have been helping set up their special investigations teams, empowering them and teaching them how to use the tools they have available to them, which surprisingly, given some of the size of these institutions, financial institutions, can be quite limited, and teaching them what typologies look like in terms of transactions, also how to be able to reach out to customers without tipping them off, and being able to assist law enforcement in conducting fairly complete investigations before they're filing a suspicious activity report or a suspicious transaction report. So that is me. The impact of carousel fraud. Why are we talking about it? A couple of figures to put up there. These are all sourced, and it'll be in the PowerPoint later if you want to go in and look at the statistics. There's definitely a tie to organized crime, and the interesting part there is 2% of organized crime equals 80% of the fraud, so it's a pretty convincing tie. The losses, very significant, as we've heard in the presentation today. The yearly losses to carousel fraud, 40 to 60 billion, is equivalent to the GDP of countries such as Belarus, Slovenia, Lithuania, Serbia, so quite significant. Today again, we heard a lot about where it applies. So traditionally it's been in electronics, technical goods, and we're seeing that move a little more away to the intangible products. How they work. So trader imports goods. As you know, VAT law is very simple, easy to follow. Obviously they take advantage of the fact that they're not, and they find loopholes and ways to try to avoid paying the VAT that is due. So they'll import typically into a country, they're not charged VAT, and they're exempt, rightly so. So in this example, a company is importing 10 million euros worth of poultry into another country. They then sell the good to yet another company, and at this point, they charge VAT on the sale. And what happens at this stage is that they do not then remit the VAT that they have been charged. So this is a term that you'll see, missing trader, associated a lot with that initial company. So here, the missing trader sells the poultry, marked it up for $15 million, and the 3.75 based on a 25% VAT does not go to the tax authority as it is supposed to. As with all schemes, you try to then obscure the source of the crime, trying to make sure that you can't follow the money in case anyone wants to, or the trail. So they sell from one business to another business. Those businesses in between are called the buffers. Now the buffers can be co-conspirators, or they just can be innocent parties who are going about their business. Typically, they will actually start selling the goods at a cheaper price because they want it to be purchased. So they'll go in and offer pretty hefty discounts in order to be able to resell the goods and try to put as much distance between the missing trader and then the final one, which we're going to see. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. The exporter. So the exporter at this point sells the goods outside of that country, and because it's going outside of the country, they then claim the VAT that they paid when they purchased the good. And so what ends up happening is the country in which all the buffers were taking place ends up losing or not receiving that initial 3.75 that they should have received when it was first sold by the missing trader. The missing trader could be missing for several reasons. It could be an identity, a false identity that has been set up. We see some shell companies being used in order to obscure the beneficial ownership. It could be the same beneficial owner as several of the buffer companies that we see involved in the transactions in the country, which we're trying to help obscure. Other times what happens is they will go ahead and they will put their company into bankruptcy. So they'll declare bankruptcy, declare insolvency. When the tax people come in to collect the missing VAT, the person's nowhere to be found. They cannot identify the beneficial owner. They can only identify directors. They'll see that there's no gain to be made. There's no funds available to be able to recover the VAT loss. So the issue here is many times it's like, well, why do we really care about that? So the government doesn't get their money. It's taken a while for both the government and for prosecutors and the courts to realize this isn't really just a victimless crime, that it affects all of society. As you know, the VAT gets used in various countries to fund social services and pave roads and all that wonderful thing that people forget about. So there's been a lot of initiative in the EU in order to try to mitigate the VAT fraud schemes. So these are just examples of several initiatives that have been underway. The quick reaction mechanism, as I mentioned, communications, electronics, they were skyrocketing in terms of the incidence of fraud associated with them when they were being imported and exported within the EU community. And it even extended to outside the EU community, so being imported from China or from the US, and then you have the same scheme that we just saw intra-EU community happening internationally. So they put together a list of products and services that for those, it was mandatory that the recipient or the seller would have to meet the tax liability right away. So the recipient or the buyer, instead of being able to abscond and become the missing trader, they were responsible for having to submit the VAT, and then at the same time could claim credits against the VAT as well. So be able to do it at that point instead of risk having the trader go missing and not submit the VAT at all. The EU directive, so there it criminalizes fraud. Another initiative in terms of the quick reaction is the reverse charge mechanism. Again, putting the onus so that the recipient or the buyer is liable for the VAT submission and not the seller. So trying to ensure that the money, again, tries to go to the Treasury as soon as possible. There's more education to local law enforcement, again, explaining why it is certain trends, red flags, sharing typologies, both with the local police as well as with the banking community. As I said, you have a second line of defense in most financial institutions, and teaching them why it is that when they see transactions flowing in a certain manner and transactions involving shell companies, which tend to be red flags for something typically, then what additional factors they should consider to be able to identify if VAT fraud is involved. The e-commerce package, that makes it more of a risk-based approach. It sets thresholds, again, for certain types of products. So if the sale is of 10,000 euro or more versus less than 10,000 euro. Again, it puts expedites, fast tracks, those under and those over, there's additional requirements that have to be met in terms of due diligence and remittance of tax. And of course, Europol, very active in terms of being able to information share between the different law enforcement communities. There are, it's the EU. GDPR is very important in terms of being able to safeguard customer information and only use it for consistent use. So that is something that sometimes can challenge investigators when they're trying to report this either to the police or when the police is trying to information share, or more importantly, when the banks are trying to information share. So I'm currently working in Denmark, and there the financial institutions, unlike in other jurisdictions, have very limited mechanisms by which they can share intelligence on certain typologies. It's very concise. It has to be about a fraud that is imminent and that it affects more than just one individual. So it has elements of organized crime. So there as well, it's making sure that you are sharing information with your national financial intelligence unit. So there, the banks have to ensure that what they're reporting to the financial intelligence unit nationally is being understood in terms of, this, I'm reporting this is suspicious for carousel fraud because of this, this, and this. So Operation Greed. This is a police operation in Denmark, and it began in about 2013. The first arrests were made in 2017. So there were 17 people there were searches, pre-dawn searches conducted at homes, businesses. There were arrests, there were seizures, banks being served with search orders and seizure orders. The defendants were primarily Danish, but of Pakistani descent. There were also individuals from Lithuania, from Germany, and from France. This, in terms of the estimates of the lost corporate tax, this case is very prominent in the Danish media. If you go ahead and Google Operation Greed, you can see the latest developments, and we'll speak about that shortly. What was interesting about this one was it wasn't your typical products-based VAT carousel fraud. There was some in terms of agricultural products being imported and exported, but the fictitious invoices were primarily for services. So for cleaning services, for transport services. So again, as we all know, when you're investigating financial crime, as soon as you're onto a typology, they changed it. We heard today from our colleagues at the plenary the difference between CumCum and CumEx and then the ones up the pyramid. So this is something that they noted as well, that it wasn't just in terms of the services where they were had workers. A company would say that they had sent 10 workers to clean a hotel. However, they would invoice for 50 workers cleaning that hotel. They would also pay their employees under the table in cash and then not remit the VAT on the invoices for them, and they also would not remit any of the deductions that they were making for their employees. That is a lot of cash, and as you can imagine, in order to have that much cash, both to be able to pay the workers and set up companies, they were using foreign exchange companies. And they were using foreign exchange companies not just to be able to convert proceeds to cash or cash to transfers, but to also try to obscure that trail of money. So they were using exchange companies. Some of them were unlicensed, unauthorized to be able to provide the services that they were providing. In other instances, it was also hitting the media. They used a very renowned cash handling service provider to set up accounts for an MSB, a money services business that they owned, in order to be able to, again, use the accounts of this multinational company and not have it traced back to that particular money service business that was owned by one of the accomplices. In terms of what they have seized, they've seized luxury cars, which include Bentleys with gold-plated everything, 23 properties, and 12.5 million krona in cash. The interesting thing about, so this again just goes through what they were, the scheme in terms of how it applied to greed, going back to our original model. But the interesting development, and now it hit the media a couple weeks ago, is what they realized is there was an accounting firm that was central to this operation. So the accounting firm helped set up all the different corporate structures that were being used in order to transfer the funds both within the country and also to get them out of the country and into offshore jurisdictions. And then several businesses, established businesses, were purchased, the directorships changed, sometimes the names were changed, sometimes they were not. And those businesses, once they came under the new ownership, were used to commingle the illicit funds. And more importantly, were also used to be able to receive transactions that are typically in cash, which if conducted in a non-cash intensive business might have attracted some attention. And those funds were then used for terrorist financing. So there's several individuals in jail right now in Spain, and the same organization involved and the same members and criminal network involved in this particular VAT fraud have now been linked to the terrorist suspects that are in court and in jail in Spain. So typically, we know terrorist financing is a little difficult to identify, especially in banking, because they tend to be small transactions, so a little similar to a lot of very small transactions, typically for donations or some type of contribution, and they tend to have a legitimate purpose and be very hard to identify and be associated to terrorist financing. Here, what was interesting is they purposely acquired businesses that were cash intensive, such as ice cream parlors, and then certain individuals were told that if you wanted to donate money to the Islamic State, then go and order this flavor of ice cream that only existed for those people. It wasn't on the menu. So it gives a hidden menu a whole new name. So this part is ongoing. With Operation Greed, the interesting part is, as I said, it started several years ago. It's in the courts right now in Denmark. So there's been a lot of media coverage on it, and it's, again, raising awareness in terms of VAT fraud isn't just tax fraud. The proceeds and what happens with it are very important and can have some very significant consequences and impacts. The Danish authorities, they have, realized, again, it was mentioned this morning, that sometimes it's necessary to partner with private agencies in order to be able to fully investigate certain types of crimes or be able to be as efficient, as effective as possible. This with the international factors in terms of law enforcement in different jurisdictions, accomplices in different countries. It was, and all the banks in Denmark were involved in this. Every single one of them has hit the headline for this police operation. Some of them in terms of banking the suspects, others in terms of lending them credit facilities and lending them credit facilities for their business as well as for their homes. Then as soon as they received those credit facilities, they declared bankruptcy, and now the banks are also trying to get in line in terms of receiving any of the funds that are recovered. And as I mentioned, it has touched several different countries. I've mentioned more than the ones that are there, but there's a lot of collaboration and cooperation within the police force. Europol is taking a lead, but also in terms of being able to elicit the assistance of forensic accountants to help identify, follow the money and identify the money trail, because sometimes even the most sophisticated revenue and excise agencies, regardless of the country they're in, resources are tight everywhere. And with this one, as I said, there the concrete links to the terrorist cell for the Islamic State in Spain. And this part of the investigation is continuing. The intelligence agencies are involved, and as you can imagine, information is flowing to identify any additional links and be able to continue to serve production orders on financial institutions, primarily financial institutions, because again, that's how you get to follow the money and identify where it goes. Just a brief outline. So the potential links were identified almost a year ago. So it has been, as you can imagine, a fairly long road for the Danish and police authorities. And they have started the trial of the 17 defendants in Denmark. The ones in Spain are being prepped for court. I suspect that they probably will not really get into the full swing of those criminal cases until there's a verdict on the ones in Denmark. So the role of investigative and intelligence consultancies. So as I briefly mentioned, we tend to get involved on two sides. So we'll try to assist the financial institutions in terms of educating them and training them. We also have forensic accountants that work on staff, and we will augment government teams with our forensic accounting teams as well. And then through the use of technology in order to be able to go through the massive transactions. And that's where Imam is going to come in.
Can you hear me okay there? Yes, looks like it. Okay, so hi, Imam Hoque. Just a bit of background, I guess, on my involvement in this sort of stuff. I think I started the first pilot to try and detect and identify, as we called it back then, MTIC fraud, or VAT carousel fraud, in about 2004-05. And that was here in the UK, so we did a lot of work around it then. I've also been involved in a whole load of things relating to detecting fraud, money laundering, etc. I helped set up the UK's Insurance Fraud Bureau, put in systems for intelligence at the NCA, tax evasion detection systems for numerous tax authorities, and also money laundering detection for banks. So what I wanted to talk about today was, if this is such a big problem, how can we go about actually detecting it much earlier in the cycle rather than relying on trying to investigate it post the event? So that's a typical typology or a pattern that you may be looking for. As Sandra described, you've got this ring of businesses with buffer businesses, the MTIC businesses, the profit takers, and so on and so forth. However, the challenge is, it doesn't look like that in reality. If you take any major tax authority, they're probably dealing with a couple of million businesses, goodness knows how many transactions, and many millions of individuals. So how do you spot those nicely formed sort of cycles within the data? In fact, generally they're not that nicely formed, because the bad guys are very innovative and they change the way they operate all the time, and they add in different tweaks to how they do things. There's some examples of people even using carbon credits as a VATable device for doing this type of fraud. So what we're trying to do is go from that big mess on the left to what's on the right, and that's quite hard. And the techniques usually come down to big data analysis. So I'm not going to get into the real nitty-gritty of analytics, and sometimes people call it AI. I mean, I did my master's in AI in '92 at Northwestern, but I wouldn't go as far as saying this is AI. It's sort of partly an expert system. It uses some big data analytics, and usually we work very closely with investigators to get their insight into the system. So the challenge is that data analytics historically has looked at one thing at a time. Everyone who comes out of university with a degree in stats and maths, they might say, right, give me all the transactions, and they'll try and analyze them, or give me all the companies, and they'll try and analyze them. That will never work, because a single transaction or company in isolation won't show you the pattern behind it. So people soon realize, well, the next step is, okay, let's look at the whole of the historic behavior of that company. Maybe we can spot a company that is involved or looks like a buffer company or looks like what's going to be an MTIC business or the profit taker. Again, that's extremely hard because they look normal in their behavior. And actually, as mentioned, quite often they are normal. They're just caught up as part of this operation. So that's when we came across this idea of, well, if you look at the way investigators tackle this, they may take tools like I2 and those sorts of things and draw charts of relationships of owners of companies and UBO structures and movements of money and goods and try and chart it all out. So we've tried to emulate that technique by using the data to identify all of those networks and use the data to surface all of that before you then apply some sort of a model to detect what you're looking for. And really, that's the core of the technique. Now, being able to do that very dynamically, being able to operate in real time, gives you the ability to do some interesting things. Like, for instance, if you're registering a company for VAT, wouldn't you have thought you might just do a quick check on it in real time after the person's paid their £15 or whatever it is, and you've given them a company half an hour later? You might want to have done some sort of a check, or at least when you come to the VAT number. So you take this approach, and what we're really talking about here is if you're trying to detect risks, you've got to look at the transactions, the entities, and the networks. And then you apply your standard models. So they could be scenarios that you're looking for, like trying to sell goods off too cheap, a very new business, a single director who's connected to a whole slew of new businesses just set up recently who then seem to transact with each other. These are all interesting modes of operating. And you can use any analytical techniques you like, from scenarios to outlier analysis to deep learning AI to whatever it may be, time series analysis. So this is your detection model, and this is what's going to kick out, have a look at this company, it looks like it's part of a network, or this network looks like it's up to something very strange. And so if you risk score, you can use this technique for many things, whether it's an insurance claim, whether it's just regular tax and tax evasion, whether it's base erosion, profit shifting. All of these things operate in networks, and that's what you're looking for, is the events that look strange, the entities that look strange for history, and the network that looks abnormal. And so really any unit that's trying to operationally manage a problem like money laundering or a problem like VAT fraud or any other type of fraud, you're really looking to achieve three objectives. First is coverage. Am I finding all the bad stuff? And that's actually quite hard, because there's the what you don't know stuff. So if you don't even know what it looks like, you don't even know if you're capturing it. So the first thing the model has to do is deal with what you've already caught. Then you have to understand the MO. You have to find more examples of the same MO, and there's bound to be lots of them. And then you need to do some outlier or behavioral analysis that says, this set of businesses, frankly, isn't operating like any other. Why not? Why are they different? And that tells you the what you don't know stuff, according to the Donald Rumsfeld approach. So that's all about coverage. Can we find more of this bad stuff? The next thing is effectiveness. So anyone who's worked in the money laundering space will be familiar with systems that generate huge volumes of false positives. Because somebody says, we've got to have rules like if someone puts in more than £10,000 of cash, generate an alert. If something else happens, generate an alert. But actually what you want to do really is connect up the dots and try and see the bigger picture so that you're reducing those false positives. And that's really critical. That makes you effective, because if you're investigating false positives, you're wasting your time. And unfortunately, that is the reality in the financial crime space. People spend a lot of time investigating false positives. And then the last part of the metric that makes an efficient unit is the efficiency by which you can carry out the investigation. If it requires you to send emails to all sorts of departments saying, can I have this bit of data? Can you check this out for me? And then you have to manually draw it on a wall with brown paper and strings and marker pens, that might take you weeks. If a system can present you that picture in the data straight away, then it takes you minutes rather than weeks. Obviously, you can plow through a lot more and you become more efficient. So they're the three metrics: more coverage, more accurate or more effective alerts, and higher efficiency of investigation. And that's really what people are trying to do. So what we tend to do when people want to deploy these sorts of approaches is we do these things that are required. One is entity resolution, single view of customer or entity. Single view of a business, quite complex when it's got multiple subsidiaries and so on and so forth. And quite difficult, for instance, if you take something like the Panama leak data, generally didn't have the date of birth. People's names, bits of addresses, maybe company names, but no date of birth. So again, tricky to resolve those to the same Imam Hoque or Imam Hoque or Imam Hoque or whatever it may be. And so that's a key part of the equation, is bringing those together, multiple data sources. They could be OCCR leaks, Panama leaks. They could be Bureau van Dijk, Dun & Bradstreet, Companies House data, AVOX. There's loads of public data available that will give you an awful lot of insight about ownership structures and so on and so forth. And then you want to combine that with your internal data, invoices, VAT returns, all that other stuff. So that's what we're seeking to do. Now, if you can achieve that, what happens is the way things are done today is, you have a fraud that's been carrying on. you've picked up on it somehow through a tip-off or an observation of something unusual, you've seen too many M-ticks, you're trying to join it all up, and then retrospectively you want to chase the money. It's really hard. I mean, we heard some of the cases are multiple years. They go on and on and on. What is far better is to interdict it much earlier in the cycle by identifying it using some automated technique and say, right, that's it. We're not going to, issue VAT numbers for these companies connected to this setup, or we're going to stop them doing what they're doing straight away. So really, it's about trying to generate those outcomes of spotting the stuff a lot earlier. And as I mentioned before, you can even go a step much earlier than that, and you could even ask yourself, do you even want to give a VAT number out to a company that's clearly connected to a VAT carousel ring? Well, probably not. So then you don't even start the cycle. But you have to be confident in terms of a system that can detect it, alert it. Someone needs to review it and say, yes, that's fine, go ahead and give the VAT number, or no, it's not. Let's, challenge it somehow. So that's what people are trying to achieve. So typically what happens is if you deploy a system, it just chews through all the data and it generates a set of alerts that you may choose to look at with a whole load of scores. Why have these things been alerted? This company seems to be selling goods far cheaper than another company, or it's suddenly started selling different goods. Or this business is connected via an ultimate beneficial owner to another business to whom they seem to be transacting with across a border. Why are they doing that sort of thing? And these types of scenarios or detection techniques are usually delivered by working with experts who really know about how this stuff works. I also did a project in the roll-on, roll-off ferry space about how you detect or pick out which truck to stop coming in from Calais to Dover when you've got about 30 minutes. And it's amazing what different things you can look for, like, a foot passenger always goes across at the same time as a given truck. Why would that be? The foot passenger is a tourist, the truck is a logistics firm. Or maybe it's a minder indicating that there's something on the truck you might be interested in. Or you could look at the company ownership structures and previous seizures of contraband with other companies that had a similar ownership structure or operating out of a very similar address, which they're coming out of, whatever it may be. But these are all bits of insight that you take from investigators and you combine with the analytical models, because the compute power can look at this stuff so much faster. It can achieve that sort of in the 30 minutes or less. So really what you want to do is flag up the networks in the data pre-built to an investigator to look at and highlight all the risks and let them observe what's actually going on. And that's the sort of capability that you can deploy for any type of financial crime. What I put up there is some of the work we do with HSBC. We work with a whole range of banks, but this is one that's won an award, so it's in the public domain and we can talk about it. There we have around 50 billion records in the system. Now that's a very, very large number. In fact, it is pretty much most of HSBC's transactional customer data, third-party data, all available with company structures, so you can join up and see the EBO operations and then see the money flows pretty much anywhere in the world within that bank within seconds. But you can also run detection scenarios. So you could say, okay, I'm really interested in when somebody moves money within a week in a circle ends up back at myself. It might go out the bank one hop and come back again, and you'll still see it because the account sort number. It might go around a few people, comes back to me, plus or minus 10% within a week. Why would I do that? Well, it's kind of fairly indicative of money laundering. So some of these networks that you find in the banking environment are really large, and they're part of very professional money laundering rings. So that little snippet up there is a huge, extensive ring that involved all sorts of social housing properties where people had registered businesses with the full intent of having them as vehicles of laundering money. They didn't know what they were doing. Someone was organizing it. And it's only when you saw the network did you realize it was really strange, because it's consistent, very cheap property, loads of companies registered, plus a couple of offshore entities. Why would someone living in a social housing property register that sort of stuff? They've just been asked to do it, fill out some paperwork, sign some stuff. They get £200 a month. They don't know what they're doing, but they're part of a massive scheme. And it becomes interesting is when you see 50 of these properties and they're all somehow connected, and then you know there's a controlling mind and it's a big industrial operation. Particularly worrying when they're Scottish limited liability partnerships and other non-transparent entities that you tend to see. That particular network stretches globally, the pseudo-anonymized version of the data that you see up there, but it goes all the way out to Russia, into the oligarchs, into the Right Honourable chap in the UK who is involved, lots of businesses, lots of offshore entities. And what's really interesting is if I just take, and I did this, it was actually I lost a whole Saturday of my life because it was so interesting. You just take the entire global network of companies that are registered through Bureau van Dijk or Dun & Bradstreet data, and you overlay the Panama record leaks. And you start looking for things like strangely non-transparent company structures, which have a lot of offshore entities. And you can see things like lots of people in a particular part of the UK, Bradford, all registered as directors of about 40 or 50 companies. All of their names slightly varied as they register each one, sometimes a slightly different date of birth. And that's connected to directors who are directors of the Rainbow Trust schools, to youth clubs, to mosques, and then ultimately out to Panama Records based in the Middle East. So either they're collecting money and sending it out, or money's coming in and they're distributing it to youth clubs and schools and so on and so forth. So it could be an example of either radicalization funding or terrorist financing. No other data, just the pattern. Another example pattern would be companies in and around Dover, where there's a director who then is a director on the board of about 50 other companies dotted around the major towns in the UK where there's only ever one other director, and then that's all connected to an offshore entity in Azerbaijan. So if you look at that, when you talk to people, they say, yeah, that's contraband. That's tobacco smuggled into the UK, distributed to the towns, cash collected, moved back out again. And you get a similar thing with yam importing companies based in Bristol and Ilford in London. It's drugs coming through. So data, when you look at it at the aggregate level in networks, becomes extremely interesting. You can find an awful lot with that data. So, just a little bit on how to get going. So this is when people talk to me and say, okay, how do I get going with this big data stuff? Because it's complicated and IT will tell me that it's half impossible to do it. And, you know, everyone in IT has a degree in sucking teeth. You know, you go there and they're like, it's really hard. Usually it's a piloting process. You think about what are the data sources you've got, how can you get them into an environment. We were just having a discussion earlier about an institution where they shift their payments onto optical storage after 2 months. It's like, oh my, that's really hard to deal with. And you need to really keep that data online. So it's a mentality about measuring what you get out of it, what's the value, and then optimizing how you work and having a program of activity to understand the implications of data quality, the availability of data, the skills you need in the organization. Today, a lot of investigators are, quotes unquote, almost crossover nerds. They know how to write bits of code and Python or SQL and develop a bit of model. But once you've got all that data together, then that's how you explore it, that's how you investigate it. So that's really all I wanted to cover, was just talk a bit about how you can go about detecting this sort of stuff using large amounts of data, because the secret is to do it earlier rather than chase it up afterwards. And I guess at that point, we have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you all very, very much indeed. I took a hell of a lot of notes. My name's Ewan Grant. I worked on carousel fraud strategy at the turn of the century in customs and excise. The strategy was largely drawn up and implemented by middle managers because it was seriously hindered by mismanagement and indeed corruption in certain aspects of senior management. The rescue team that was parachuted in from MI5 and MI6 had to spend a lot of their time dealing with the corruption issues, and so therefore the middle management had to get on with Carousel. Carousel is strategic criminality. My questions are, in relation to Denmark, but it has implications everywhere, has the elephant in the room topic of the Danske Bank scandal and what that reveals about company formation and brass plates given any big impetus to all the European countries working together on this much more seriously? Secondly, the practical challenge of why did it take so long? That's not a criticism, that's a question. Why did it take so long? Because I wonder whether purely criminal investigation, which I know is very much the way in many continental European countries, as opposed to civil, is the answer. And thirdly, but not least, how confident can you be that the new European Public Prosecutor's Office and the pan-European networks, the European Banking Agency and the European Commission, are about just how much this is deep state and is used particularly on the border states of the EU. I know Europol's done a lot and is doing more. I wonder how much that has really permeated. EPPO have got carousel fraud as one of their priorities. Are they going to be able to do it? Because are they going to be given enough support all across the board? Thank you. Sorry, it's a bit of a, but that reflects, I think, the extreme importance of this. This is deep state stuff, and I think too often in many countries it's been treated as really high level but ordinary revenue crime. Thank you.
I can comment, I guess, on what I've observed on the bank side of dealing with this, because obviously the banks are a major instrument of government in terms of the regulation and their ability to detect or try to detect. So I think, you know, there is a sea change amongst banking over the last couple of years. My observation was when I was doing stuff in banking in 2004, 5, 6, and 7, I was doing fraud stuff because it was real money the bank was losing and they had to deal with it. Then you had all the major fines, and now the financial crime angle has become far more compelling for the banks. The fines are very large, and the banks understand the reputational hit and damage. So I am aware of a couple of cross-bank initiatives taken on by the banks themselves in Europe, in the Nordics and in the Benelux sort of region. Obviously you have government working closely with banks, trying to think about how can they interdict all manner of crime better. So you've got things like the SARS reform program in the UK, trying to think through how to better do some of this stuff. The challenge you've got is that the banks carry a huge amount of the valuable data for detection, and by the time you got to production order, you're sort of already into that post the event investigation. The issue is the banks are not necessarily able to look for all types of criminality. We do mule account detection for one of the major UK high street bank, not HSBC as it happens up there. And in detecting the mules, we actually ended up detecting the predicate crimes, which in many cases in their situation was human trafficking, drugs related, and so on and so forth. Can a bank detect VAT carousel fraud? They probably could if they had a really hard look. No, but they're not asked to. You know, technically banks should be looking for tax evasion as well. Again, it's very hard for them to do that. And they're busy just trying to make sure they address money laundering at this stage, which is obviously their core objective, along with sanctions and a few other things. I don't know about the government side.
So on the government side, what's interesting is we've been asked to come in and help with the awareness and the training. So I think there are some changes. They are trying to ensure that their prosecutors are a little more,
Who are they?
the state. So,
Which state?
so the EU.
Which state? The EU isn't a state. Sorry, the EU isn't a state.
No, fair enough. So governments like Latvia, governments like Denmark, governments like Germany, they're trying to ensure that their prosecutors are educated when they are talking about financial crime and when they are describing the impact of financial crime.
The other comment on government, I think your observation is correct. In the past, I've worked with governments all over the world, from Canada through to Indonesia, through to Japan, and so on and so forth. VAT carousel, or sales tax related frauds, are interesting to them, but you do come across the issue of corruption. And then literally I might be saying something hugely logical around how you can go about detecting, and why do you have all your investigators checking all businesses and asking them about the revenue and nothing on the private side? Well, it's because there's some backhanding involved in that. And that does happen. But I think governments now are starting to get wise, particularly to VAT carousel, because it is one of those types of tax evasion where typically you lose the money out of your country. And that's painful. I mean, the black economy and money going around and people not, that's
actually stolen.
Yeah, the money is, so we've been introduced to tax authorities on the border of ex-USSR who are interested in VAT carousel. People seem to want to do stuff about it.
Hi. Are there common types of goods that are susceptible to carousel fraud? Because I know through Dover at one point a lot of mobile telephones would certainly going through there because that was well reported. But are there other types of common goods that would be noticeable if one was looking in that sense?
I mean, it seems to vary. I mentioned carbon credits tax. That was one very large case. A single attempted VAT carousel fraud at 300 million. So a single transaction. I also came across frozen chicken stuff, which is the most bizarre thing. Frozen chickens going around. I don't know. I mean, that's probably loads. Do you have a view?
I can assure you it was loads. Yes. Sand,
Yeah.
tires,
Anything.
bars.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, the reverse payment mechanism initiative, so those, the two EU directives for the alternate, basically they were instituted to combat VAT fraud. They expired in 1998 and they've been renewed to 2022 until the EU develops a single market VAT structure. And in there, they have listed the goods which are more susceptible, which is why they're on that short list. It tends to be traditionally a lot of electronics as well.
Hello, I'm Steve Swan from BBC News. I just wondered how susceptible or vulnerable you think Britain is to VAT carousel fraud, given the ease with which people can set up companies here.
HMRC does have detection capability, which is a good thing. So the objective of Companies House obviously is all about the ease by which you set up companies. Companies House actually has put a consultation out to change some of their objectives to be around other things that they should do beyond just the ease of creation of a company. Like maybe you might want to just check the KYC, know your customer, of the director, and a few other things. So my personal view is that's going to be crucial because there's all sorts of criminality is now organised through company structures. In fact, I wrote a response to that consultation. So hopefully we're going to see that improve. So really at the moment against VAT Carousel, our defence lies with HMRC and what they're doing.
I was very interested by your Danish example of this prosecution. I can't remember what was the name of it. But what was clear was that very little money was going to be recovered out of that process. And what we are seeing at the end of the day, and the tax carbon fraud, I come from France, and it's been hit severely by this issue, is that governments, and it's very interesting, I think prevention, you're right, is really the way to go forward, but at the end of the day, I think that talking about the amounts, we're talking about huge amounts. There's very little done to seriously recover the money. And when we are seeing those schemes, I mean, you can think, because it's difficult to go after the fraudsters, although you should, but there are a few deep pockets out there that, you know, could be targeted, and that's not being done. I wonder if you have an idea as to why is that?
I think you're right. If you look at the world of organised criminality, and in fact, it was probably 15 years back when the NCA used to be called SOCA, Serious Organised Crime Agency. The initial objective was to go after the very, very, very senior criminals, but after that, they decided to step down to the next layer of around 1,000 or so. I can't remember the exact number of the criminals. I guess primarily the really, really top senior criminals are actually quite hard to pin down. They have very good lawyers. You may go through a huge amount of work and never actually manage to pin them down for anything. So if you really want to interdict, you try and go to the layers below. I mean, I think that's probably the explanation around this, is that the top of the chain is extremely smart.
Well, I think drinks await everyone on the Sky Bar. Thank you very much.